The Engero Tales, Tales of the Soul. Teenage pregnancy, poverty, and the pandemic, our family's journey. The weight of the world. The early morning sun bathed the bustling streets of Mbale, Uganda in golden light as 27-year-old Ciara made her way to her small shop on the corner of the main road. The market was alive with chatter, the clinking of coins, and the smell of roasted maize mingling with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. For Ciara, this daily scene was both comforting and exhausting, a constant reminder of her responsibilities. She adjusted the faded scarf on her head and shifted the weight of a basket filled with fresh produce. Her shop was modest, a wooden structure propped up with tin sheets, but it was the lifeline for her family. After their mother's passing, Ciara had become the pillar of their small household, sacrificing her education and dreams to ensure her siblings had a chance at life. At home, her 15-year-old sister, Najwa, was finishing breakfast, millet porridge and a single banana. Najwa was the youngest and the most loved, a bright spark in the otherwise challenging life Ciara led. She had always been ambitious, often dreaming aloud about becoming a nurse like their late mother. Najwa, don't forget to revise your science notes today, Ciara reminded her as she prepared to leave for work. Najwa sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. Ciara, you don't have to remind me every single day. I'm not a child. Ciara smiled softly but felt a pang of worry. Najwa had grown more impatient lately, her once firm dedication to school wavering under the weight of teenage impulses and the allure of freedom. In recent weeks, Najwa had started spending more time with her friends after school, returning home later than usual. Ciara had noticed subtle changes, the way Najwa laughed more freely at her phone screen, the reluctance in her answers when asked where she had been. Despite her growing concerns, Ciara held on to the hope that Najwa's intelligence and their late mother's values would guide her. That evening, Ciara returned home to find Najwa chatting excitedly with a group of neighborhood girls. Their voices carried the carefree tone of youth, but Ciara couldn't help but feel a disconnect. She watched from the doorway, her tired eyes tracing the outline of her sister's animated gestures. Najwa, Ciara called softly. Time to help with dinner. Najwa hesitated, her friends casting knowing glances before leaving. As they dispersed, one of them muttered, "You're always under her thumb." The comment stung, but Najwa didn't respond. She walked into the house, shoulders slumped, her earlier excitement replaced by quiet resentment. Later that night, as Ciara sat on the edge of her bed, counting the day's meager earnings, a voice crackled on the radio. It was a government announcement: a nationwide lockdown would begin in 3 days due to the rapidly spreading COVID-19 pandemic. Schools would be closed indefinitely. Ciara froze, the coins slipping through her fingers. Her mind raced with worry. What would this mean for their fragile household? For Najwa's education? For their survival? The next morning, Ciara tried to explain the severity of the situation to Najwa, but her sister's reaction was far from what she expected. "So, no school?" Najwa asked, a hint of excitement in her voice. "No school," Ciara confirmed, frowning. "But this isn't a holiday, Najwa. You'll need to stay disciplined." "We'll study at home," Najwa interrupted, her face lighting up. "Don't worry so much, Ciara. Finally, some freedom." As Najwa left the room, humming a popular tune, Ciara felt a heavy knot form in her chest. She had spent her life holding this family together, sacrificing everything to keep Najwa on track. But now, with the lockdown looming, she feared losing control, not just of their household, but of Najwa's future. Outside, the streets were quieter than usual as people prepared for the uncertainty ahead. For Ciara, the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. The turning point. The days blended together in the suffocating heat of the lockdown. Mbale, once a bustling town of energy and life, had quieted to a mere echo of its former self. Most shops, like Ciara's, remained closed, their owners forced to rely on what little stock they had left and the kindness of neighbors. Every morning, Ciara woke early, preparing a meager breakfast for herself and Najwa before heading to the back of the shop to salvage what little income she could. Ciara's hands trembled as she counted the few notes she had left. The stock she had ordered from the wholesalers now sat unused, and she was uncertain when she would be able to replenish her goods. Every penny counted. Najwa, once content with school and the prospect of a future as a nurse like their late mother, now roamed the house restlessly. Without the structure of school, she seemed adrift, and her gaze often lingered on her phone, scrolling through social media and messages from her friends. They were all in the same boat, yet somehow, they seemed freer, unburdened by the responsibilities that weighed on Ciara. At first, Najwa would sit with her sister, listening to the sound of their mother's old cooking pots clanging in the kitchen, as Ciara cooked their simple meals. But soon, her visits became less frequent. She no longer cared to help with household chores or keep up with the homeschooling Ciara had started. "You're not a child anymore, Najwa," Ciara often scolded her, but Najwa simply rolled her eyes and shrugged, her frustration growing as the days stretched on. The sight of Najwa's discontent weighed heavily on Ciara. She understood that her sister needed more than just education, she needed an outlet for her restlessness, something to connect with. But the world had changed, and Ciara felt the walls closing in around them. Najwa began sneaking out in the evenings, meeting with her friends despite Ciara's constant warnings. She'd return late at night, her eyes glittering with secrets Ciara could no longer decipher. On one such evening, when the sun was setting, casting long shadows over their small house, Najwa returned in tears, her cheeks streaked with dirt. "I don't want to be here anymore, Ciara," she said, her voice raw. "Everything's falling apart." Ciara's heart sank. She pulled her sister close, her hands trembling as she stroked her hair. "Najwa, you're just going through a phase. We'll get through this together. You don't need to run away from everything." But Najwa pulled away, anger flashing in her eyes. "You don't understand. I'm stuck. There's nothing to do, and you keep pressuring me to be perfect, like Mom wanted me to be." Ciara stood frozen, the words stinging more than she could bear. Najwa had always admired their mother. She had been the guiding light in their family, an embodiment of grace and wisdom, always telling Najwa that she was destined for something bigger. Now it felt as though Najwa was rejecting everything their mother had instilled in her. Days turned into weeks, and Najwa's behavior grew more unpredictable. She became withdrawn, disappearing for hours at a time. One evening, Ciara heard a knock on the door. When she opened it, Najwa stood there, pale and trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and fear. "Ciara," she whispered, "I need to tell you something." Ciara's stomach dropped as she saw the fear in her sister's eyes. She knew, somehow, that this was the moment her world would shift forever. "I'm pregnant," Najwa confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Ciara like a hammer. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of the revelation settled over her. She had always feared this moment, but she never imagined it would come like this, unexpected, without warning, and without the foundation of guidance she had hoped to give her sister. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ciara's heart shattered, and all at once, a wave of emotions rushed over her: shock, disappointment, anger, and above all, profound sadness. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Ciara's voice cracked as she struggled to control her emotions. "I didn't know how," Najwa responded, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to disappoint you. I thought maybe I could fix it on my own." Ciara felt the sting of betrayal. Her sister had kept this secret, had hidden her pain and confusion in silence, thinking she could navigate the chaos alone. But Ciara was no longer just an older sister, she was now responsible for 2 lives, and the weight of that responsibility threatened to crush her. Over the next few days, the strain between them became unbearable. Najwa insisted that she could handle the pregnancy, that she didn't need Ciara's help or anyone else's. But Ciara could see through the bravado, the fear and confusion lingering behind her sister's eyes. She wanted to comfort her, to show her the strength that their mother had shown them, but the gap between them had widened, and every attempt to reach out was met with resistance. As Ciara sat in their small living room, her thoughts swirled. How had they ended up here? She had given up everything for Najwa, and now it seemed as though everything was unraveling before her eyes. The future that she had fought so hard to build for Najwa seemed lost, slipping through her fingers like sand. But Ciara knew one thing: she couldn't abandon her sister. Despite the anger, despite the betrayal, she had to be the one to guide Najwa through the darkness, even if it meant facing her own shattered dreams in the process. A child raising a child. The days following Amani's birth were a blur of exhaustion and heartache. Najwa, who had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, was now faced with the daunting reality of motherhood at just 16. The baby girl, whom she named Amani, a name that meant peace, brought anything but tranquility into their already tumultuous life. Amani's cries were constant, a high-pitched wail that seemed to echo through the tiny house, rattling the fragile foundation of their already strained lives. Najwa struggled with sleepless nights, desperately trying to soothe her daughter as she fought to adjust to a role she was never prepared for. Every time she tried to feed Amani, her frail body seemed to reject it, and the baby's cries only grew louder. Ciara watched helplessly, torn between caring for her sister and keeping the household afloat. Food, which had always been scarce, now became a constant concern. What little they had was stretched thin, and Amani showed signs of malnutrition, her skin pale, her cries weak and frequent. The reality of Najwa's choices hit Ciara harder each day, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were both sinking into an abyss. In the early mornings, long before the sun rose, Ciara left the house to take on extra work at the market, trying to make enough money to buy food and essentials. She had no choice but to keep pushing herself harder, even as her body begged for rest. By the time she returned home, the sun was already setting, casting a red glow over the compound. The tiredness in her bones was unbearable, but she couldn't afford to stop. Meanwhile, Najwa grew more withdrawn, overwhelmed by the relentless demands of her baby. The sparkle in her eyes that once held so much promise had faded into dull despair. She no longer had the energy to argue with Ciara or lash out as she had before. Instead, she simply accepted her fate, taking care of Amani with the same weariness that clung to Ciara's every movement. One evening, as Ciara returned home later than usual, the air in the house was thick with silence. She set down her basket and looked around. Najwa sat in the corner, cradling Amani in her arms. The baby was too quiet, too still. Najwa, what's wrong? Ciara's voice was sharp with concern. Najwa looked up, her face streaked with tears. She won't stop crying, Ciara. I don't know what to do anymore. Ciara rushed to her side, instinctively checking the baby. Amani's tiny body felt warm, but there was no fever, just the steady thrum of her weak little heart. Ciara's stomach twisted. She had seen this before. Malnutrition. It was a nightmare she had hoped to avoid, but now it was their reality. We need to get her to the clinic, Ciara said, her voice cracking. She knew the cost of medical care was out of their reach, but something had to be done. Najwa's eyes welled up. We don't have any money, Ciara. How can we afford it? She looked at the baby in her arms, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I never thought it would be like this. I was so selfish. Ciara's heart shattered at the sight of her sister's breakdown. Najwa had always been strong, but now she was a mere shadow of the girl who had once dreamed of a better life. It was as though the weight of motherhood had stolen her innocence, leaving only regret behind. Ciara took a deep breath, fighting the urge to cry herself. It's not your fault, Najwa. It just happened. We'll figure this out together. But deep down, Ciara knew that together wasn't enough anymore. She had sacrificed so much already, her own future, her dreams, and yet here they were, living in the shadow of decisions that neither of them had fully understood at the time. The next few days were a blur of worry and sleepless nights. Amani's condition worsened, and with no money for a doctor or medicine, Ciara began asking around for help. But the answers she received were always the same: sympathy, but no solutions. Everyone was struggling in the same way. One night, as Ciara sat by the window, the weight of their circumstances pressing down on her, she heard Najwa's voice. "I don't know what I was thinking, Ciara. I thought I could handle it. But I can't. I should have listened to you. I should have waited." Ciara turned, her heart heavy with emotion. She had wanted to hear those words, or wanted to hear her sister express regret and take responsibility. But hearing them now, knowing the cost, was harder than she had imagined. "I know, Najwa," Ciara said softly, walking over to her. "I know you didn't mean for any of this. You were a child, we were children. But now we have to be strong for Amani." Najwa nodded, wiping away her tears. "I'm scared, Ciara. I'm scared for Amani. I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know how to fix this." Ciara sat beside her, pulling her into an embrace. "We'll figure it out, okay? One step at a time." But even as she said the words, Ciara felt a pang of hopelessness. She had given up everything for Najwa, and now, the future of her niece hung in the balance. The dream of a better life seemed so far away, clouded by a fog of regret and uncertainty. As Amani's soft cries echoed in the background, Ciara realized that her sister's mistakes had become their shared burden. And yet, despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, she knew there was no turning back. Family, after all, was what bound them together in the darkest of times. Lessons from the ashes. The winds of gossip began to stir as soon as news of Najwa's pregnancy spread throughout the town. In a small community like theirs, where everyone knew everyone else's business, Ciara soon became a subject of scrutiny. Whispers followed her as she walked down the street, accompanied by stares that seemed to pierce through her very soul. Ciara couldn't even keep her own sister in check, some would say. Now look at the mess they're in. For the first time in her life, Ciara felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her. She had always taken pride in being the protector, the one who ensured her family stayed on track, but now it seemed as though all of her efforts were in vain. The quiet moments of reflection were the hardest, when the loneliness of her situation settled in, and the sting of rejection from her community felt overwhelming. But Ciara was never one to give up. As the whispers grew louder, so did her resolve. Instead of sinking into despair, she saw an opportunity to turn her family's story into something that could help others. "I can't change what happened," Ciara said to herself one evening, staring out at the setting sun. "But I can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The following week, Ciara began speaking to the young girls in the neighborhood. At first, they came with skepticism, unsure of what to expect from a woman who had so publicly failed to protect her sister from life's harshest realities. Ciara stood in front of a small gathering in the town square, Najwa by her side, and shared their story not as a tale of failure, but as a cautionary tale. She spoke with a raw honesty that only someone who had lived through hardship could convey. "I know many of you think that life will wait for you, that you have time to dream and enjoy your youth. But the truth is, time does not wait. One wrong decision can change everything." She spoke of Najwa's lost dreams, of the way the pandemic had stripped their lives of structure and opportunity. She shared the sacrifices she had made to keep her family together, and how, even in her darkest moments, she had never stopped fighting for them. But most of all, she emphasized the importance of education, discipline, and resisting the pressure to fit in with others at the cost of one's future. Najwa, initially hesitant, stood off to the side, her arms crossed, uncertain of her place in this new narrative. She hadn't fully embraced her sister's mission and still felt the sting of regret for her own choices. She watched, feeling like a mere shadow of the girl who once dreamed of a different life. But as Ciara's words sank in, a small flicker of recognition began to stir within her. As Ciara's talks continued over the next few weeks, more and more young girls began to show up. They listened intently, nodding as Ciara's message of hope and resilience began to resonate with them. Slowly, Najwa started to come around. She observed how Ciara was making a difference in the lives of others, how her words were sparking change in the community. And despite her initial reluctance, Najwa could see the power in what her sister was doing. One afternoon, after Ciara finished speaking at a gathering, Najwa approached her. "I want to help," she said, her voice soft but determined. "I've made my mistakes, but I don't want to see any other girls go through what I've been through. I want to be part of this." Ciara smiled, a weight lifting off her shoulders. "You don't have to do it for me, Najwa. Do it for them, for the girls who need to hear what we've learned the hard way." Together, they began to create workshops for young girls in the town. They focused on topics like self-esteem, education, and making wise choices for their future. Najwa began sharing her own experience, though still reluctant at times, but the more she spoke, the more she felt empowered by her own story. Her journey was no longer defined by her mistakes, it was defined by her courage to learn from them. At home, Najwa took small steps to rebuild her life. Each day, she spent time studying at home, revisiting the subjects she had once loved but had left behind. Her mind, once clouded by regret and confusion, slowly began to clear. She began learning parenting skills, studying books, and attending virtual parenting classes where she could. It wasn't easy, her responsibilities as a mother were still demanding, but she now felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. Her relationship with Amani, her daughter, began to improve. She was still learning, but there were moments of joy, moments where she felt like she was truly mothering her daughter, not out of obligation, but out of love. The early struggles, though painful, were beginning to give way to growth. For Ciara, watching her sister's transformation was the most rewarding part of this new chapter. The emotional distance that had once existed between them started to fade. They spent more time together, discussing everything from parenting to education, and for the first time in years, Ciara felt like she wasn't alone in her fight for a better future. The bond they shared was stronger than it had ever been. They were no longer just sisters, they were partners in this shared mission to create change in their community. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last group of girls left their workshop, Ciara and Najwa stood side by side, looking out over the town. "We've come a long way," Najwa said, her voice full of emotion. Ciara nodded. "We have. And we are just getting started." As they looked out at the community they were beginning to reshape, Ciara felt a sense of pride welling up inside her. They had risen from the ashes of their past, and now, together, they were turning their story into a beacon of hope for others. The end of Part 1. In Part 2, a mysterious figure emerges, another girl falls victim, and sabotage threatens their fragile progress. As emotional fallout intensifies, the gripping reality of betrayal and tragedy unfolds. Will hope prevail, and can they reshape the legacy of the shadows that haunt their past? Don't miss this thrilling continuation. The end. Subscribe, like and share our channel Engero Tales, the Tales of the Soul. Don't miss an episode as new tales await you every week. Let the stories awaken your spirit and fill your soul. Watch. Share. Keep the tales alive. See you again.